Well, good evening, everybody. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. I'm the host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast here at the Libertarian Christian Institute, here with my sort of co-host for tonight, Cody Cook, who is a co-host over at the Libertarian Christians podcast. We're all part of the Christians for Liberty network here at the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm sorry for the late start. I've been having some tech problems for the last few weeks that I've been procrastinating, and because I have too much of a high time preference. And so, in my degenerate ways, I've been putting off the problems of today for tomorrow until all that forestalling led to a critical mass tonight, and my main computer failed me. So, I'm trying to do this through my laptop. We'll see how well it goes. Hopefully, you can let us know in the comments if the volume is good, if the signal is coming through strong, and we're just going to try to roll with it and keep things going. I think this is sort of God's revenge for, or at least some kind of cosmic karma of some sort for that time we did that immigration presentation, and you had all the tech issues, and so.
Well, before I move on, for those who haven't read Hans Hermann Hoppe, I just want to note that you just came out of the closet.
Oh well, I thought I've been out of the Hoppe closet for a while. But...
Well, no, the
no, I get it. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Sorry, that went by. I just wanted to make sure that wasn't lost. So.
Yes. Haha. Jacob's gay. Now we got the we got the that's okay. I called you Scrappy Doo once, which is probably a little bit more derogatory than being called gay. So
yeah, I think
we'll call it even. But we're tonight going to be talking about. So I decided to sort of put Cody's pacifism to the test because I thought, can he really watch 3.5 hours of Dave Smith and Nick Fuentes and still believe in nonviolence? I think you made it through, but from what you told me, it was a little bit touch and go there for a little while. Do you want to give like your just? So we're here to talk about just to make it explicitly obvious, although I don't think it's too dated. I think it was a week or two ago. Dave Smith had Nick Fuentes on his show. The internet made it a big thing. You and I have been on this stick lately of kind of we did a reaction to Dave Smith's appearances on the Cole Humans show with what is that? What is it? Oh, Coleman Hughes, yeah, with
Look, I like Cole
the Free Press. Cole Human. We're mixing and matching names here tonight. So Coleman Hughes and Dave Smith had a conversation. We reacted to that, gave our thoughts, kind of riffed off each other. And we're going to do the same thing tonight with this conversation. Although instead of foreign policy, this is going to dive more into libertarian theory, into the culture war. So I want you to start, Cody, and I'm going to make you go solo here for a little bit while I just make sure everything's working good on my end. But I'll let you give your kind of opening remarks in terms of what you were thinking about this going into it. And, don't pull any punches. I'm friends with Dave, but I know you have perhaps more critical things to say of him than I do. But your thoughts about Dave, your thoughts about Nick, and going to the conversation, what you were hoping to see, what you were afraid to see, perhaps, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Well, and for those who haven't watched and maybe who are a little unfamiliar with some of these figures, so this was a very long conversation with Dave Smith and Nick Fuentes, which is an interesting name. I think that must be Polish. But he's and so what's kind of I guess important about this conversation, interesting about this conversation, is Fuentes is somebody who has been comfortable to call himself a racist. He has this kind of ethnic identitarian ideology on the new right, and part of what's kind of anyway. So Dave Smith and Nick Fuentes. Dave Smith is a libertarian, but he also has some kind of new right sympathies. He's a little on the border on some of those things. If only he wouldn't cross it. And so I came into this conversation thinking, okay, so Dave Smith, he's libertarian, individualist. He's talking to this guy who's a racist, and so what's this conversation going to look like? What are my hopes and dreams and expectations for that? And so, I start by saying that, it's absolutely essential in my mind to reject the collectivizing impulse of racism, which is both anti-Christian and anti-libertarian. And I'll say that as loudly and as often as I need to. And I would say, racism is an anthropological heresy that denies Christian truth just as much as Unitarianism is a Christological heresy, which is maybe why they're both called Arianism, for those who get that joke. And so that being said, I think there is there is a lot of value, I think, in addressing clearly and calmly the claims, these claims that are racist, nationalistic, anti-Semitic, etc. I don't think it's actually enough to simply say, you've committed a thought crime, now sit down and shut up, which is oftentimes where these kind of critiques go to. And I think part of the reason why that is a bad idea is it emboldens some of these bad actors to say, well, see, they can't address our claims, and that's why they won't even try. They just call us racist. You should wear racist as a badge of honor or whatever, right? And so I think what I'm hoping Smith is going to do before I start watching it, which is, to provide an atmosphere where there can be some from friendliness and camaraderie, but also hopefully he's going to address some of the worst parts of Nick Fuentes' ideology. And so I think we need lots more of that. And more than that, I'd say, the more of that kind of thing that we have, the more that takes place, I think the easier it is for people who don't want to spend hours and hours of research to try to, demonstrate why Candace Owens is wrong about a cabal of Jewish Satanists running the world and molesting children to harvest their adrenochrome. I think I'm conflating a few different conspiracy theories there, but you get my point. That we actually do need, to have people who are willing to just, not just to say, well, that's anti-Semitic, forget it, but like, here's why it's wrong, right? And so, I think when you have strong, dispassionate, fact-based arguments to point to, there is real value in that. It serves everyone else as well, so that they don't necessarily have to spend those hours doing that research, and they can point to a resource that demonstrates the reality, right? And I think it also shows that when we are critiquing things like racism and nationalism and ethno-nationalism, anti-Semitism, that we're not just hiding behind slogans and groupthink, that it's actually really the racists who are anti-human and anti-freedom. And that's why I've written a lot of articles for LCI, like The Antidote to Anti-Semitism, Race Mythology Redux, Immigration Policy Should Not Be Tied to Identity Politics. And all those articles argue that light and not censorship is the best disinfectant. So I think, and I'll say this, and then I'll wrap up and let Jacob give his kind of priors. I think there's also a Christian component to why we should debate these issues instead of just shutting down bad ideas. And it's that we are called to love our enemies and our neighbors. And, there could be people in our families or churches who are susceptible to these kind of bad ideas. And we're called to treat them with love and compassion. And so this kind of woke idea that you should denounce and cut off contact with your dad because he's not sufficiently anti-racist or uses the wrong pronouns or whatever is ridiculous. I think you can change the minds of people around you who have bad ideas. You can do it ideally, but if you can't, I think you're still going to have to see them at Thanksgiving. That relationship is still important. And so there has to be kind of some sort of balance here. You have to address these issues, but you have to do it with kindness and love and compassion. And so that's what I'm hoping is going to happen. We're going to get both. I'm hoping to see Dave respecting the humanity of Nick Fuentes and showing him compassion, but he also forcefully and thoughtfully showing him where he's wrong. And that's the criteria that I sort of came into this discussion assessing it. So I did watch it. I'm kind of talking like I haven't watched it yet, but I kind of came into it sort of fresh. I kind of put my notes down, like, here's what I'm hoping to see. And that was it. So now we're going to actually see, after Jacob gives his introduction, how it actually went.
Right on. And while you were talking, and I was listening the whole time, but I was able to fix my my computer setup, so now I'm much more comfortable, and I'm confident that we'll be able to. I was worried about my laptop's ability to be able to screen share this the video of Dave and Nick. It's a good little work laptop, but not meant for streaming. So now we're back in the normal setup. I have the little ear. Everything feels natural, right? Kind of like when you get in someone else's car. It just like that still doesn't feel right. But I think that's all good thoughts. I have a particular, and we've talked about this before. Going into this, I've had recent changes, not like full, like 180 turns, but maybe slight recalculations, so to speak, on the subjects that you kind of touched on there in terms of like evaluating bigotry and racism and the right, broadly speaking. from libertarian and Christian principles. I obviously came up in the liberty movement. So I was brought into the liberty movement by Dave. So I have I have a bias there, obviously, and I'm friends with Dave. And then even more broadly than that, I joined because Dave and a lot of the people that I knew were part of the Mises Caucus. I joined the Mises Caucus, and they had this sort of like more right-wing populist Ron Paul Mises Institute sort of a style. Some people wanted to call it like a revival of the paleo strategy, which I still don't think is quite accurate. I think it's fair to say there are at least some elements
Yeah.
that rhyme with fusionism.
History doesn't, I was about to say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Exactly. So it would be, I think it would be disingenuous, even like if I was trying to defend it, to say that like, I think they were like, well, the paleo strategy didn't work. And maybe the last, at the time of the Mises Caucus rise and takeover, from their perspective, like the last 5 to 10 years of like trying to pander to more centrist and sort of like mainstream left and some progressive left social views while mixing in social conservatism. So the whole idea of like or fiscal conservatism, we're fiscally conservative and socially liberal, that seemed to also have issues and to not work. So I think this left a lot of people joining the Mises Caucus to think like, well, we need to find something that's not full blown paleo strategy, but that's not what the Libertarian Party was doing at the time. And so we thought that we could kind of capitalize on populist energy. And we had this sort of idea that like, we don't care about racism. We don't care about bigotry. The left has sort of destroyed, the words bigot and racist and homophobic and, even like anti-Semitic and Nazi. These words get thrown out all the time. And I developed a certain allergy to these terms and to these concepts. Like if someone said that person's a Nazi, I would just reflexively not just be skeptical, but just completely like, no, I don't believe you. And actually, like if you're calling this person a Nazi, that means like they're probably not a Nazi. They're probably someone that I would like and agree with and get along with, or if I don't completely agree with them, they're not a Nazi, right? And agreeing with something that Dave brings up at some point in the stream, that I think that I agree with the way Ron Paul put it, bigotry, racism, these things, they're collectivism, they're irrational, and we as libertarians and as Christians reject them, but they just don't register in my outrage meter as much as other things. And partly was because I believed that we kind of lived in a post racist society, and I don't mean like literally post-racist, but just that like as much as like there's examples of slavery in the world today, but they might seem comparatively less than what they used to be. I thought like, yeah, there's still racists today and racism today, but we're still like way better off than we used to be in these regards. And I just think it's like we need to be if we're acting like racism and bigotry are still these frontiers of social progress that we need to be championing, and that they're like at the forefront of our focus. Like I feel like that's getting it wrong. And like the things that like we need to be actually focusing on is like, if you want to talk about race, how about we talk about how the American empire is preaching, to white people about their their privilege and to be less racist, while they go halfway around the world and bomb brown people, right? So we're talking about race, I'm going to bring it up in that context, or bring it up on the, how the war on drugs is, disproportionately affecting minorities. I'd bring it up in those contexts, but not in, the way the left would talk about those things. Certainly since Trump has won, though, and you've noticed this shift, that I've noticed that there are elements on the right which, kind of predictably, I think people like James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson and others, two people who I have some strong political disagreements with, but I think I got this term from Doug Stewart. I think they're often directionally correct. They were predicting that the left wing woke identity politics was going to sort of create this right wing reactionary thing. As much as James Lindsay doesn't understand blowback when it comes to foreign policy, he understands blowback in the culture war. So I just need him to connect those dots. But yeah, like that was a thing, and I knew that could happen, but I didn't. I think I was just kind of blind to it. I think it was, from my perception, that it was like nothing, and then all at once it was a problem. But more likely it was building up gradually behind the scenes, and I was just kind of turning a blind eye to it, perhaps somewhat subconsciously, perhaps sometimes even willfully. So I'm trying to recalculate, even though I'm still, I kind of see one side here who I think are correct in pointing out some problems with like the new right and with people like Fuentes. And then I still kind of am sympathetic towards Dave and sort of the camp he represents, where I think like, okay, but like there's still something that we were reacting to from kind of the old guard establishment, both in and outside the Liberty Circle, where like they got their calculation wrong, the pendulum swung too far the other way, and now I'm trying to find like where's the actual point we need to be at where we're dialed incorrectly. So I guess that's where I'm kind of coming from, and I was kind of hoping that Dave would be able to, in this conversation, showcase something, approximating what I think is the right way forward in terms of addressing issues on the right as a libertarian, and while rejecting talking about these things from a woke left perspective, but also not adopting and agreeing with the right-wing identitarian perspective as well.
Right. Well, I appreciate you checking your privilege and acknowledging your racism. No, I mean,
Yes.
I understand what you're saying. I think, my critique, and I'm sure I've got my own blinders, and for a while I thought, well, maybe I'm libertarian left, and then I started listening to some of those people, and I was like, maybe not, maybe, but like, I think, for me, my concern about that kind of, well, they use the word too much, so we're going to kind of revolt against that. It's like, maybe there's that kind of whole boy who cried wolf thing, right? Well, you blame the boy who cries wolf, but that doesn't mean there's no wolves. And I think my concern about the Mises Caucus, and also maybe the classical liberal caucus from the other direction, was that they were letting kind of left-wing and right-wing culture war categories, I think, warp libertarianism, because I feel like libertarianism is very centered. It's not about kind of reaction. It's not about sort of a really an attitude toward time like progressivism or conservatism is. It's really principle centered. And so when I sort of saw, I felt like people were going, well, we're going to kind of set aside the principles because we want to sort of side with a certain place in the culture we're here. To me, that felt like kind of an ideological failure or twisting. So that was kind of my concern. And maybe it has gotten worse. I don't know. I mean, it's tough to say because Twitter shows you so many horrible things, and you go, okay, well, this isn't probably how most people think. So you have to keep that in balance for sure. So So anyway, so I wasn't necessarily supposed to respond to you, but just was thinking.
No, I think that's fine. I'm actually trying to pull up our notes here so I can look at the timestamps, and for some reason, I'm having a hard time seeing the timestamps. So I don't know if you can help me out and remind me what the first timestamp is on your end, because I can't see it for some reason.
Yeah, I've got one right at 11 minutes about about the Rogan shouldn't have Daryl Cooper on anymore conversation.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to pull that up. We're going to go full screen here. By the way, can you guys who are watching, because we kind of didn't have time for pre-sound checks and then I switched gear halfway. Can you just let me know if my audio and Cody's audio are, more or less in parity with each other? No one's too loud or too soft, because I don't want you guys to like listen to the next hour, hour and a half, however long we're on here, and kind of be like, struggling to follow along. So just let me know in the comments and I can adjust things if needed. So, all right, let me remember how to do this. It'll be really great, everyone, while I'm doing this. You see me struggling because it's actually hard to do a show and produce a show at the same time. It would be great if LCI, and we're continuing to grow and we're funding new projects all the time. We have books that are coming out next year that we're, Cody and I and the team are really excited to share with you. But we're hoping that we can keep adding more people to the team and keep, increasing the quality of the things that we're producing for you, and having like full-time producers and stuff to help us with these live streams would be great. And you can make that happen if you want to continue to support this show and see it grow by going to libertarianchristians.com/donate. And then you won't have to hear me continue to make awkward pitches for you to donate while I stumble around with technology. So
instead you'll get to hear him promote My Pillow.
That's right. Yes. Once we get to that point, then we'll start doing ad reads, just like the Daily Wire. All right. So we got this pulled up at about the 11-minute mark. Cody, if you this was more your timestamp, so just let me know when you want to interject and stop it, or I can stop it when I want to interject. But we'll just kind of play it by ear. And guys, let me know in the comments if I think I did this right, but let me know you can hear it.
I think something fundamental to it was that it was like with all these guys, with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, your whole calling card was, we have these conversations. We don't shut voices out. You have to win the argument. We're against cancel culture. And then they're like, to watch them going on these tours of like, Rogan shouldn't have Daryl Cooper on anymore and all this. You're like, yeah, but come on, dude. Now, what are you? You just kind of, you exposed yourself for being exactly what you claim not to be. And that is something that people don't get over easily.
Right. Well, and no one's really on their side on that.
All right. So I'll minimize that for a second, and we can. So what were your thoughts on that? Would you agree with Dave? Disagree with Dave?
I was gonna say, wouldn't it be funny if we just played the next 2.5 hours and just didn't say? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so the thing that occurs to me, it's like, well, is there a difference between hosting a conversation to, maybe address a bad ideology versus, and this is, I know, one of those kind of woke words, but platforming that ideology. So like, if my church wanted to host a debate with the Jehovah's Witness, I think that would be good and reasonable, right? But if they were like, we're going to let the Jehovah's Witness preach from the pulpit every Sunday, I'd be like, I don't know about that, right? And so, and kind of similarly, like LCI, like I'd be cool with having LCI having on like Nick Fuentes to debate, what I think are his bad ideas, but I wouldn't want LCI to offer him a show or have him on as a regular. And so I'm thinking like, can we make those distinctions within this kind of window of free speech and open inquiry, that we should debate bad ideas but not platform them? Now, I understand that there might be still room for shows that are literally like, we'll have anybody on. You can come on and you can say anything you want, and we'll let you do it and we'll talk to you. But there's, I think, this kind of part of me that's I'm not a moral relativist. I think you want to be able to, you can't address the ideas unless you hear them. But I also feel like, certain things you don't want to sort of center as just as reasonable, right? And we'll get into this a little bit, the ways in which this kind of media environment where Nick Fuentes and Dave Smith and us can reach an audience, where prior to this time period, it's like you have to be sort of picked by the major networks to be able to have a voice or something like that. That's good and that's bad. You allow new voices on that might have really interesting things to say. But the downside is you kind of democratize knowledge and expertise. And then like people who are really like, stupid seem like they're just as legitimate as people who aren't. And but anyway, but so I guess I'm just wondering, I'd be curious to, I mean, what do you think about that distinction? Is there room to sort of say we don't want a platform, but we do want to have conversations, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think these are, so I want to address that this gets really muddy on so many levels, on like the spirit of free speech versus the policy of free speech. Because I know that another angle on this would be that people would say, well, people have a right to use their voices to say we don't want people on these platforms, and insofar as the platforms are private companies, they can choose how to allow and not allow people on their platforms, and it's not, and it gets muddy when are these people in places of power, like when when Trump's FCC was saying to take Jimmy Kimmel off the show. Now, I think Jimmy Kimmel just deserved to like not be on the air anymore, because I don't think he's been relevant or funny in years. But like when you then like throw the government element into it, where it's like pressuring private corporations and businesses to act a certain way, that at the very least muddies the water, if not kind of like is actually a violation of free speech. But I think there's also the spirit of free speech beyond just the government policy, where the pursuit of truth requires the sort of free exchange of ideas and taking the taboos off of the table. I like the the old Tom Woods meme in his old intros, like setting fire to the index card of allowable opinion. And to some extent, I think that if you like, let's take a controversial subject like race and IQ. If you make that like too taboo and no one talks about it except the people who are really racist, then only racist people are talking about race and IQ. So anyone who looks into it finds the discourse is like they're getting kind of a skewed view of that conversation, versus a more balanced conversation about it, where like we recognize, okay, these scores differ among different ethnicities. Why is that? Let's examine the test. Let's examine the environmental factors. Are there genetic factors? Are the genetic factors mutable or immutable? And, like I looked into all that, and I think that there are some genetic factors, but that like genetics, just like, human like genealogy, like these aren't fixed things. And sometimes it's like it'll seem like it's, present for a generation, but then like the next generation, because they were fed better, had better nourishment, better security, then like you see things start to equalize. It's called like the Flynn effect, I think, in science.
Mm.
But like a lot of people who initially got into like race and IQ and stuff didn't hear about this because they're only talking about this stuff in the context of like people who are, have a particular agenda. Where this then applies to like what you were getting at, like I don't know where that balance is, because I think there's two things at play. One, how much pushback is enough is kind of a subjective thing. Like there's not an objective standard to that. And I think like every host has their own way of doing things. Like you and I, you and I have done like a formal debate, right? And that was different because like Doug's the moderator, and we kind of contrived circumstances to be like, we're going to be, still like nice to each other, but we're going to be super confrontational. The whole point is we're here to debate, right? Not everyone wants to do that. Not everyone is good with doing that. And sometimes it's like, well, I want to have a conversation with you where we explore ideas and you can offer your positions why you believe this, and I can kind of offer a contrast to that. But do we want to spend the entire time disagreeing? And I've been criticized for example, I had Stephen Wolf on the show a year and a half ago, maybe coming up on 2 years. And some people, even within LCI, thought that perhaps I was a little bit too nice and that I didn't challenge him enough. But what I did was like, I had him on. It was actually me and Alex had him on. And we had a really good conversation, a little bit of talking about the disagreements. But then I invited Stephen back on for a second conversation, and that conversation still in a very friendly spirit because we'd kind of built a, sort of a repartee at that point. I started to kind of bring up, well, here's more of my issues of why this seems like you're saying something like, we are the government, and I just don't think that's comprehensible. And this is why I think this is a more biblical worldview, and, and et cetera. Right. So I think I get your perspective of like, if you just like, invite a white nationalist on and they just sit there and they're just like, and we want to deport all the black people and, we want to kill all minorities. You just sit there and nod the whole time. Like, yeah. Oh, wow. That's so interesting. Like, that's kind of like the reductio ad absurdum of like, all right, maybe you shouldn't just like, have a nice conversation with no pushback with just anyone who says anything. But on the flip side, if Dave had invited, Nick on and just like, yelled at him all the whole time, like, you're a Nazi, you're a racist, you're a a sexist, that doesn't get anything accomplished either. So I think the best thing is to just kind of be like, if you have a platform, use it the way you want to use it. Everyone's going to do their own thing, and that's kind of the free market at work. So I know it was a long answer, but it's a very important question, and one I've given a lot of thought to as it pertains to myself.
Do you feel like there's a bit of a hypocrisy with someone like Dave Smith, who, because I mean, to me, like, I do think there's some value in sort of saying, like, as a culture, there are things that are a little bit taboo, not that we're going to shut down through force, but like there's certain ideas that we sort of go, that's really not acceptable. Like, you can't be like, let's do the Holocaust again. Like, that's like just that's not like something we're going to listen to and go, oh well, yeah, you have a right to that opinion. Like, you do, but like, we're not like cool with it, right? And so like, but I wonder, because I mean, Smith is kind of doing this thing. It's like, we shouldn't downgrade ideas or perspectives to save the culture because that's anti-freedom, but we should stop letting so many Mexicans in the country, right? It's like, there's this kind of weird thing where, you don't want to shut down, bad actors or sort of shame them, or sort of say, well, that's not really a value that we have as a culture. That's not really cool. But we'll save the culture by, stopping so many immigrants. You know what I mean? I mean, is there, a little bit of hypocrisy there for the new right to do that?
I'm not sure. Can you restate it? 'Cause I'm just having a hard time following it.
Well, so there's this kind of idea of protecting the culture, and that's part of where some of these, and I'm not saying that's necessarily Dave Smith's perspective, but this kind of idea that you get from, but we sort of have this culture, we have these values, we want to protect it, and so that's one of the reasons why we should be closed borders or more restrictive on immigration.
Right.
But then, like, if somebody goes, yeah, I don't think we should like consider Nick Fuentes' ideas to be like culturally acceptable. I think we should kind of shame that, right? And it's like, well, we don't want to do that because we don't want to shut down free speech because freedom is such a value.
Yeah,
right?
so there's definitely a tension there with that, and I think in some of our back and forth, I even said that Dave's immigration position is somewhat in conflict with sometimes his anti-war position and this here. I think it's complicated. I think that there is something to the question of, do we? I think Dave's whole point from his I don't want to get too into the weeds here on the immigration stuff, but I think Dave is asking a question and sometimes not arguing it in the most effective way, but it's asking a question of are we obligated to let anyone in and everyone in? Is there never a number where it becomes too much? Especially if you consider we would all agree, barring some weird natural catastrophe in a stateless society, it would be kind of weird to have, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 million people, coming in all at once, different cultures. And we don't have to, agree that all cultures are good, etc. I guess what you're pointing at, and I think even Dave has said this self-admittedly, is that where you draw the line in terms of where are we going to sort of stop considering these pragmatic concerns in terms of what we can maybe the opposite side to this would say you're making a libertarian argument for authoritarianism, right? Which I'm very sympathetic to, and that's kind of a slippery slope. And I think that you're kind of pointing out to that slippery slope there. And I think that is a valid concern. And where we draw the line can seem somewhat arbitrary, but sometimes we have a hard time. Sort of Dave actually brings this up in the conversation with Nick. He's like, well, when should people start driving cars? We know 5 years old is too young. It'd be ridiculous if we had a law that said you can't drive till you're 25. Where exactly is the line? We don't, sometimes we have a hard time drawing lines, and the lines we draw, we might be that's not perfectly justified. That's kind of arbitrary. I think the libertarian worldview is that these decisions should be, sort of necessarily decentralized because they're hard to draw, and having a central planner draw it for an entire continental landmass is problematic. But then it's well, while we still have that central planner, what do we do? So I get what you're saying. I would say I don't mean to cop out and give a very sort of Jello answer of saying I see both sides there, but I do. I kind of see both sides there, and I think that it's one of those tensions that is why immigration continues to be one of the most hotly contested issues among libertarians.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe to put a finer point on it, I guess the inconsistency I see is sort of well, we should make sure that Nazis can get platformed, but we can't have so many Mexicans here, right? Because because and I think,
well, keep in mind the internet is not bound by one country, right? So I mean, you can have conversations. I would say I think Dave would point out that Nick could be in a different country and still have a conversation with him. And so I think there's a difference between conversations on platforms which are on the internet and having communication and having free trade versus should everyone be able to be heard and have a their some capacity for free speech, and should we fight for free speech versus should we allow everyone to live in this specific area who wants to come and live in this area? I see a slight tension there in terms of on the extremes, you're there are probably some immigrants who have more libertarian views that align more with Dave on everything but immigration, who want to come here, that Dave might be advocating not to come here, while he's platforming and defending the rights of someone like Nick Fuentes. And that can seem on the surface a little bit of an inconsistency if you're connecting that to we have to protect the culture. But I don't know. I guess it depends on what resolution. On a zoomed out view, I kind of see the tension. But I think if we dive into it, it is a little bit apples and oranges. But I again, I kind of see both sides here.
Okay, fair enough. Did you have another clip you want to go to, or?
My first timestamp won't come in till the 55-minute mark. So what's the next one after 11 you have?
I've got 12 minutes and 20 seconds.
Okay, so I will put this back up. I will try to hover as close to that as I can. I got 12 minutes. We'll just play it from there.
They were probably not even in good faith. And now they want to come out and tell us, well, but like you said, we can't have that conversation, or Daryl Cooper's too far, or they're doing the same thing to him that they did to you, where they said, well, you're not a historian. And it's like, okay, well, neither is really anybody. Does anybody have the right to critically think, or to read books, or to offer an opinion? Or are we literally just going to be told this is what you're allowed to think because, we're the experts?
Well, it's also the other thing, dude, because I'm like, I got in this, well, I guess not. I mean, you were doing your thing, I think, at the time too, but for whatever reason, I got in like at not really in, but I was doing shows at Fox News for a while. There were like a few particular hosts who were really good to me and had me on. It was like Kennedy and she had a Libertarian show there, so it made sense. And then Greg Gutfeld used to put me on. Tom Shalhoub used to put me on. So this is like back even in the day. And then I've done a bunch of their shows since. And it's like, one of the things that just bugs me about the whole conversation too is you're like, look, I'm not saying there's a lot of garbage online, so I'm not like defending, there's dumb political commentators online. But when you're talking about like the elite level, or like I'm just saying, objectively speaking, I used to do those panels. If you go back and look at any of the panels I was on, out there somewhere, it's just always me carving everybody up because they don't know anything. Right. Like it was, dude, me and you are compared to the old guard, elite level. Like they maybe would occasionally get someone in there. Occasionally you'd have Pat Buchanan on a segment. You'd have someone who like Ron Paul, or someone who really knew what they were talking about. But like every day on cable news. So the idea of being like, well, you're not an expert. Or Daryl Cooper's not an expert. Do you know what you're hearing on cable news? Do you know how much?
Is that a good stopping point?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I thought he was going to get to his point a little bit quicker. He took a while there. Yeah. So, I mean, the kind of the note that I had here, and I kind of previewed this earlier, but like this kind of question, can only experts talk? This is the importance of expertise. And so like, and this is a question I keep coming back to because, this idea, this is the democratization of ideas that everybody, can have a microphone. Does sound like, I mean, it's like Thomas Sowell says, everything's trade-offs. There's a lot of value to that, but there is like a downside in that sometimes people who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about can kind of get put up on the same place as if they do. Right. And so like, in thinking about expertise, it's like, I think expertise is often a shorthand to knowledge because we all have individual limitations. We don't all have time to research all these sort of complicated issues. So sometimes we trust an expert who seems to have integrity and knows a lot about that subject. I mean, and it's ultimately kind of the division of labor. And so, but there's two problems, I think, with expertise. One is that, intellectual expertise, unlike, technical expertise, like being a plumber or a car mechanic, is often intertwined with political power. So to be considered an expert in the realm of ideas is to be in the club. And I think that's probably even more so in places like, foreign policy experts, right? And I think that brings us to that second problem with intellectual expertise, which is being in the club often means that there is like a community bias. When you're part of a scientific establishment, for instance, in theory, everything, should be questioned. There should always be creative people doubting the conventional wisdom and testing it. That's the scientific method, yada, yada, yada. But sometimes the establishment settles on a position, often for political rather than scientific reasons, and they rally around it to prevent it from being questioned. And I think the way you solve that is you platform experts that don't work for the establishment as well, and you emphasize the importance of intelligent dissident voices within a field to keep the majority honest. So I think you do have to bring in, intelligent minority opinions to challenge that. What I don't think you want to do is, just sort of solve it by saying, okay, we've given up on the experts. What do the dumbest or most off the wall people in the country have to say now? And I think that sort of mindset is kind of where we go, like kind of from, I don't know, like a, Barack Obama or whatever to a Donald Trump in the White House, or Nick Fuentes being treated as like an important thought leader. And in the pre-internet days, we had these gatekeepers that you had to vouch, that somebody knew what they were talking about. They had something to hear, worth hearing before they could gain an audience. And that's good and bad, because it's good because it's, your limited time and attention aren't being flooded with dumb opinions, but it is being flooded with people whom the establishment's vetted. And that's not necessarily always great opinions either. And so I think the internet is interesting because it levels out the experts and the doofuses, and it gives morons like Cody Cook a platform and a potential audience. But I think there can be value in that leveling, because good outsider ideas are finally given a seat at the table. But it also, I think, helps me to appreciate, Smith's argument against egalitarianism when I consider the fact that there are people out there who think Nick Fuentes' views are just as valuable or even more valuable than a specialist in one of the fields he pontificates about, and that they're just not, right. So, and that's another one of these sort of things we talk about. The Smith at one point does this sort of thing where he's like, well, it was in the last conversation where he's like, I'm no egalitarian, but when we talk about the value of different ideas, he kind of is, right. It's like, oh, of course, every stupid idea is welcome at the table. And so, I think, Smith himself brings up an example of this around 2 hours and 45 minutes. He talks about how Netanyahu had to publicly address whether he had hired someone to murder Charlie Kirk, right? And like that would not have happened, 30 years ago. And so, like, Smith thinks that's pretty cool, but like, is it actually cool that the dumbest conspiracy theories have to be addressed with the same seriousness or more seriousness, in fact, as like actual crimes against humanity that Israel might be committing? And so there's not like a right or wrong answer here, but it just, there's a lot of, I think, tension because, there are people that I respect because I think they're knowledgeable. Now, not all of them are necessarily degreed or whatever, but I believe they've done their homework. I believe they have integrity. And so I'm interested in hearing their opinions. And, but not everybody, other people will, listen to, Candace Owens. So anyway, but I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
So I think the problem is that we need elites and we need experts, but the institutions that should exist to properly help us, like, give us at least signals of competency and expertise have been just thoroughly corrupted and completely, like, they're completely morally and like expertly, like, just they've been debunked, they've been discredited over the last 10 years, 20 years, however, it's been happening a long time. And I don't think it's just a left-wing problem, it's a right-wing problem too. And because of that, people have turned to, more of the, this person doesn't have a degree. I mean, I don't have a degree in anything. I'm just a person online who's read I am the Christian libertarian equivalent of Dave Smith. Like, Dave Smith will say, I'm not an expert. I'm just a comedian who's read a lot of books. And I'm like, I'm not an expert. I'm just a mechanic who's read a lot of books, right? And I like to study theology. I mean, I've thought about going to seminary. I've thought about getting a degree. It's not in the cards at the moment. But I do think, on one hand, the internet makes it easier for, like, information to be less gate kept. And so you don't necessarily need these, like, physical learning centers and degrees to learn things as much as you used to be able to. And there's a level in which the sort of, like, university and expertise apparatus is less about testing how smart you are and less about, sort of testing, like, how competent you are. And it's more about testing how well are you able to strengthen the sort of, like, establishment opinion and uphold the status quo, right? And stay within the index card of allowable opinion. And someone who, again, who says a lot of things who are correct and then just fails to live them out is Jordan Peterson, who says that, in order to get to the most vital ideas that we need as a society to advance, it's like you need 99 stupid ideas to get to that one good idea. Right? This is just how that's how the free market works, right? Creative destruction and trial and error, and that's how I think even ideas develop. It's how society and culture develops. Is that you do kind of have to let sometimes the insane people, like, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Now the problem is, in the same way that the government distorts the economy with artificially low interest rates and the printing of money and spending money into the economy and wars and the criminal, everything the government does distorts the economy. It also distorts the marketplace of ideas. And so when you suppress ideas for so long and lie to people for so long, that creates a sort of blowback where then people just don't trust anything, and they find the people who were telling the truth about one thing and then go, well, now I trust this person, sort of like implicitly. and say, well, I've been lied to by this establishment for so long that, like, what else have they been lying about? And I think that's a good question to ask. But the same intellectual rigor you put into that one thing you found out the establishment was lying to you about, you then have to apply that consistently. You can't just find, and you shouldn't do this with Nick Fuentes. You shouldn't even do it with Dave Smith. You shouldn't even do it with Ron Paul. I mean, you should be willing to hear what people have to say, but always be Bible says test the spirits. There's a proverb. It's like one man will sound right till another comes and presents his case. Like, scrutinize everything, but be willing to hear something that maybe comes from someone who doesn't have, the right credentials, especially in this day and age, because I think those are kind of, I do think we live in a moment where the expert class has discredited itself, and we can say, listen, ideally, we want an expert class, but we don't have. I think it also, how do you define expertise, right? Because that's kind of like having a degree. There are listen, I don't presume to say Dave Smith is right about everything, but I know there are people with history degrees on the Middle East who Dave Smith would be able to probably talk circles around. Not now. Now there's probably like, the top 1% of people in the history field who would be able to talk circles around Dave. But you just kind of get my point. Like, these things are kind of relative, not to the point where I think they're I mean, relative in a sense that they're a spectrum, not relative in a terms of that, like, there is no good or bad or truth or falsehood.
Yeah, no, and I think, and maybe this is one of these things that, maybe the market decides eventually, but like, when you say, well, you've got to listen to different opinions, I agree with that. I think that the challenge is, people would say, before you'd have sort of controlled opposition or whatever, you'd have the Democrat guy and the Republican guy, and they basically believe the same thing and they differ on a little bit, and that's not great. But like, at this point, I think there are so many people who are claiming, to have knowledge and that their ideas should be listened to. And I think we don't have the time to like sort through that. And so, like, I feel like there is some value in sort of saying as a society that, well, certain people seem to be more knowledgeable. Certain people seem to be more trustworthy. And I guess it may say, maybe that's one of those market decides kind of things. But, for me, I think that's kind of a challenge. It's like, people can kind of come out with crazy conspiracy theories, and it's easy to say something crazy. It's a lot harder and takes a lot more time to debunk it. And so I think there's value in that, but I don't know. I wish people were a little more skeptical. And I think, talking about the expert class, like we watched that kind of Hughes versus Smith debate before. And what was interesting about it is I was inclined to agree with Smith on most of the major points. And what was interesting is Hughes, I think Smith talked like somebody who was ideologically consistent, and Hughes talked like somebody who had some kind of knowledge about how the system works from the inside. And those are different kinds of knowledge. And so, like, I think, my field is theology. I've got a bachelor's and a master's in theology. And I'll tell you this, experts in theology say different dumb things than non-experts in theology. And but the one benefit is that the experts will kind of reach these conclusions. They'll do this group think. They'll kind of let ideology blind them. But you can ultimately still have a conversation with them about, what does the text say? What's the history say? And it can be sort of more intelligent. Like when somebody comes up to you and says, well, the first letters in the Bible, Bereshit, the bara is a letter that means this, and Resh is a letter that means that. When it's like, we're not even having the same kind of conversation with like somebody who says, okay, well, Bereshit, that actually refers to something that's an ongoing action. It doesn't mean in the beginning. It means, it's just like a completely different kind of conversation. And so I think, and to be clear, I'm not saying anybody should be shut down. I think free speech is valuable, but I think we can sort of ask these questions about, in what ways has this democratization of expertise or knowledge been good, and in what ways has it been bad? And
but
I think we can do that more.
I think this will play out more as we get into future ones. But before I play the next one, I'll just let this thought, loose into the ether. But I think, and Dave even said this, there's a point in which Dave is not platforming Nick. I mean, for better or worse, Nick kind of has, as big of a following, if not more of a following than Dave does. If we're just talking about like online following and whatnot, and Dave, he's faced some pushback, but Dave hasn't faced anywhere near the level of like, just total scale cancellation that Nick has. And despite all the best efforts of like the mainstream apparatuses and the gatekeepers on the right, they haven't been able to like make Nick go away. And so I think there is a point where if someone isn't going away by ignoring them, then yeah, you kind of have to, like, if they have a big following, even if you think their ideas are wrong, even if you think their ideas are harmful, well, at that point, like the market is telling you you have to contend with them, right? You can't just say, it's like, listen, if Dave was platforming Nick Fuentes and Nick Fuentes had like 20 followers online, I'd go like, well, that probably was stupid. But I think at this point it was kind of like, I think even Dave was like, you're so big that like, even if I disagree with you on a lot of things, like these conversations need to be had because, on the stuff we agree on, good. The stuff we disagree on, one of us is right and one of us isn't. And we're not going to get to the bottom of that. And we're not going to move society in the right direction on any of those things if we just kind of like wall ourselves off to our own corner of the internet and just, stay in our echo chambers. So that, anyway, it's kind of a balancing act. All right. I did figure out how to view the document correctly. So I have the next timestamp pulled up.
Would be a bigger scandal
right
than the prior. And like, there's something fundamentally wrong with that. Like that is a really sick thing about your society.
Yeah.
And there is this almost like, and I think has been for my entire lifetime, maybe before that probably, that there's almost this unspoken cultural value that clearly is a left-wing value that puts at the absolute top of the hierarchy of outrages bigotry. Like bigotry is supposed to be up here at the absolute. That's the worst thing in the world that you can be. When in fact, like that is just not my moral outlook on the world. Yeah, bigotry is something we all have in excess. I think it's bad, but there's much worse things than that. And one of the things that I always found very interesting was that the alt-right guys were really anti-war. And this also for you and the Groypers are very anti-war. And so to me, in my world, like war is really a much worse thing than racism. Yeah. I'm not sure how there's a counter argument to that, although we treat it like war is that's just policy. And this is the worst thing you can do. And so I immediately rejected that. And so in fact, with the Jordan Peterson thing, I'll leave him alone after this, but it's like, you want to talk about psychopaths? Like, sir, you were on record saying, give them hell. That was your response. And for the guy who talks about hell all the time.
Yeah, right.
There's you don't think hell it really exists? It does. You haven't met enough. Yeah, go to Gaza. Hell does exist. You said give them hell, and that's exactly what they got. Like, so, maybe examine yourself before you're saying, oh, but he said a thing about the Jews, so he's the dark tetrad. But then it just seemed to me on top of that. So that's like my worldview. Like, I don't actually think bigotry is the worst thing. I think it can be bad, but I don't think it's the worst thing. But then even from like, say, a liberal worldview, like, isn't like Daryl Davis like your
let me pause
the big hero story? And I'm not like claiming that that's what I'm doing with you. It's not.
Right.
But like the idea of like, you're like, even the guy who you say is the famous guy who like converted all the Klansmen, well, he did it by talking to him and being decent. Just be cool. That's like rule number one. Like always, and that always seems so obvious to me, particularly as a Jewish person, but I just like as a Jew, I would say that. But that you're just like, oh, there's these people who hate Jews. I was like, well, I should probably be cool. Because it's kind of hard for people to hate someone who's cool to them. And it's just so weird to me that everybody else's opinion is like, no, this is the one thing that's unacceptable, bigotry.
There we go. My computer was failing me again, so I was like, Dave, stop talking in the computer. I guess the Jews really do run the media, because Dave was just like, I'm going to hijack this stream and make it so I can't stop talking. But anyway, go ahead, Cody, with your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think my timestamp may have been a few seconds late, because what he said, the very tail end of it was kind of what I initially tagged, which was he said something like, the president could bomb a wedding in like Afghanistan and on the same day say the blacks, and the latter would be a bigger story. And I was like, well, I think he's, right, that in the interest of addressing racism, we've made like kind of faux pas and microaggressions into like crimes against humanity. But he goes on to like poo-poo the idea that bigotry itself and not just social faux pas, like saying the blacks, is like a serious issue. And so I think there is an overcorrection on the part of the cultural right to wokeism, because I mean, how does the president get away with bombing a wedding in Afghanistan or whatever? He gets away with it because we've elevated the prerogatives of the state and our nation over the human right to life that non-Americans have. And what is that? That's that's racism. It's saying these people are fundamentally not human, not valuable in the same way that we are. And so I think, I think Smith's point is like, well, it's kind of like, well, you can be racist without being a warmonger, or you can be a warmonger without being racist. And like, yeah, technically true, but they are related ideas. And so I think that's why I say that as libertarians, we can't silence racists. We can't, with force or whatever. But I don't think we should be quick to say that they're on our team. I actually think we shouldn't say that they're on our team. I think, people who are racist are fundamentally rejecting the foundation of libertarianism, which are the rights of all human beings. And so if you deny the humanity of your fellows and their equality as rights bearers, you aren't really libertarian. So this kind of clip early on, about 18 minutes in, made me a little anxious about how well Smith was going to meet my criteria for a successful interaction with Nick Fuentes. I thought, okay, he's really not going to push back in any significant way. By the way, your visual has frozen, but I don't know if you can still hear me or speak. Are you still here, or will I need to talk for a while? Uh-oh. Well, we're live, and I can't hear him. I'm going to go ahead and make sure he hasn't sent me a message on Signal. And if he hasn't, I'll talk for a little bit, because I do have more notes. The problem is I just don't have... He sent me a message that said, computer did weird thing. Oh, fair enough. Okay. So, let's read some comments while I'm coming back. Okay. So I'm not going to respond to videos because I don't have them. I'm going to read some comments, and I'm going to try to sound like a good host. So just about all the comments that I'm seeing are from earlier, when people were saying how good the audio was. Let's see here. Let's pull one up here. I think Dave's saying bigotry ain't quite as horrific as state-sanctioned murder. Of course, bigotry ain't good, but I think it's less severe than war. I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. And it's kind of one of those weird things that, that we sort of can, as a culture, say that, saying insensitive things or holding stupid ideas is as bad as actually killing people. It's like that kind of a sort of misreading of James, sort of like, well, if you commit one sin, you've committed them all. And yeah, so it's a hierarchy of outrage, I suppose. Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is that some of these ideas do lead somewhere. And so my concern with not wanting to address things like racism is we do make it acceptable to dehumanize others. And I think that is what we're doing in war. We're saying that these people's rights, these people's humanity is not as significant or important as our interests. And so I think they're within kind of the same family. It's like, Jesus says, you've already committed adultery when you look upon a woman with lust. Well, you haven't exactly. And it's better to look than to actually commit the crime. But you're in the same vicinity. You're going down that path. Let's see here. Sorry, I know that having pauses is not a great idea. I'll add a note here. We talked a little bit about immigration earlier, and there's a point that Smith raises at 28 minutes where he says, people don't want their country changed demographically. MAGA has just been more honest about that. Demographic change happened against the will of the people. And I'd be curious to hear Jacob's point on this, because I think Jacob has made a sort of a similar point, that our immigration policy has been dictated by the state, and that that in some way the immigration that we have had flowing in is the responsibility of the state. When it seems to me that the laws have been largely very difficult, draconian. Cato Institute has this game called the immigration game, where it talks about how difficult it is to be here legally. And so to me, I don't see that same concern. I don't think that demographic change has happened against the will of the people, in the sense that, the state is, forcing this kind of immigration. Certainly there have been state policies involving taking in refugees, and sometimes it happens on the local level. I'm near Springfield, Ohio, where Donald Trump said they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, because we'd had immigrants coming in, I believe Haiti, if I'm remembering correctly. And so, there, you had a lot of immigrants dumped at once, and maybe there were some, bad central management there of policies. But just kind of standing back and looking broadly at this idea of demographic change. I can hear a bit of the Ohio accent. I don't have an accent. Everybody else has an accent. When Europeans came to this land, that was a demographic change the native people living here didn't ask for. They were cool with it until, until things got violent and white people stopped keeping their agreements with few exceptions. When the United States took over the Southwest from Mexico, that was a demographic change that the native people living here didn't ask for. Now, people on the new right will say, well, we weren't immigrants, we were conquerors. And that makes it good somehow, to violating the non-aggression principle. If you do something in war, there goes that whole mentality, right? That the war is fine and the racism is bad. Well, if you win something in war, then you deserve it, right? And but I think the changes that Smith and company are really concerned about here, the ones that they call forced, are usually just people whose ancestors were here before us, crossing the border to live and work here without asking the government's permission first. And so I think Smith is trying to steelman that kind of conservative right-wing side, and but I think at times maybe he flirts a little bit with these kind of early 20th century nativist ideas that I think are basically anti-libertarian collectivist garbage. And I don't want to go too hard against Dave Smith, because I know he's a friend of Jacob, and I actually do value a lot of what he brings to the table. I think he's been a decent popularizer. I'm a little concerned about some of the new right stuff, and not always my cup of tea, but that's fine. While I'm waiting for Jacob, I will talk a little bit about kind of my concern in this conversation that I think is going to be more clear as we move forward, which is there a compatibility with the new right and with libertarianism? And as we kind of move into this, we're going to see, I think, Dave sort of lumping himself in with this group that's Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, alt-right personalities. And it seems like to some extent, Dave does think of himself as libertarian, but I think he also thinks of himself, maybe even primarily, at least in this conversation, as a new right guy. And then secondarily as a libertarian guy. And I feel like that would explain some of his policy views and emphases, like the closed border stuff. And maybe that's why I'm a little bit ambivalent about Smith. I think when he speaks clearly in favor of libertarian ideas and he helps spread them, I think that's valuable. But I just simply don't give a crap about furthering some new right, big tent that's big enough to encapsulate, legitimate racists, wackos, crazy people, and also Dave Smith, like that, and also maybe me, right? That's not a tent that I'm really interested in. And so to the degree that is his tribe, he's not really in my tribe, right? And he's not entirely in that tribe, but I think he's a little bit in that tribe. And so a lot of this kind of language that we see, the friend-enemy distinction, the anti-egalitarianism thing, well, anti-egalitarianism comes a little bit from Murray Rothbard as well. But prior to Murray Rothbard, we really have this being rejected in the 1920s conservative revolution in Germany, figures like Carl Schmitt and Oswald Spengler. And I think a lot of them are forming the roots of these kind of new right ideas. And the conservative revolution is meant to repudiate everything that classical liberalism stood for and to force an old hierarchical order over this kind of ethno-state. And I think perhaps libertarians can occasionally make some common cause with these kind of new right folks when it's useful, if we're very careful, but we shouldn't see them as fundamentally being on our side. There is a question here about defining the new right. And I use the phrase, so I should probably answer it, but I'd be curious to get Jacob's definition first before I give mine.
Yeah, I don't even know. Like, people talk about the woke right, the new right, the alt right. Like, there's not neat categories. I think, so I guess the new right feels like it's maybe it's like a broad term that kind of encapsulates a couple of different groups who don't always even get along, right? Because if you think about the old, well, I guess like what historical framework are we talking about, right? The old right is like the paleocons. So like your like Pat Buchanan's, your, you know, like old school you know, Republicans of that kind of stripe. Then you have like the neocons who then like to millennials like me can feel like the old right because by the time we get to like the Bush years, you feel like the neocons are just the establishment right. And then I guess like the new right is sort of like encapsulates what maybe used to be considered the what was it, the ideological dark web, and then or the intellectual dark web, and
Mhm.
then you know, so you have like your people who used to be like, you know, progressives or center liberals who kind of like uh left the left or the left left them. And but then you also have people who are so like you know, you can say your James Lindsay's, your uh Michael Malice's, your Brett White. It's a wide you know, ideological spread there. Some of them who probably wouldn't even consider themselves to be right wing, even though they kind of functionally are because they're supporting Trump and voting Republican and all that. But then also like people might use that term to describe uh uh you know the more you know MAGA populist side, which can you know there's a wide spread there. There's the libertarian right. You got like Dave Smith and people might consider new right, and then you have like your Groypers and the Nick Fuentes. So it's like I don't know. It does seem to be one of those things that's you know, woke right at least has an attempt at a defining term. New right, it's like yeah, I don't know. But I'm curious what you think the new right is. If there's is there a more targeted use of that term than I'm aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably kind of a loose collection in some ways, but I think there are certain themes that come up a lot. I think one of them is the rejection of liberalism in the sense of like kind of classical liberalism or the liberal order. I think that's pretty common. I think the rejection of egalitarianism and the promotion of hierarchy, I think, is a big part of it. Um, and we got there was that debate that you know you and I were a part of with Alex Bernardo on that question about you know what's is, you know because Murray Rothbard uses that kind of egalitarian language in a negative way, but when you go back and you read, I think some of the original influencers of the new right, these kind of conservative revolution Germany figures like Carl Schmitt and Oswald Spengler and um, you know, I think obviously, you know, Nazi ideas are involved in this a little bit. I feel like there's kind of this almost Nietzschean idea as well of the will to power. I think there's also kind of I think a might makes right, um, kind of a Western chauvinism sort of idea of a tradition that might not necessarily actually be historically accurate, but the sort of sense of you know that which is powerful, that which is strong, that which is healthy, that which is genetically hygienic. So there's you see a lot of that as part of it, and then I think what happens at the peripheries is I think when you start talking about being like against egalitarianism and being in favor of hierarchy, I think you're going to have some people who are kind of on the libertarian side who will say, "Well, yeah, I'm against egalitarianism as progressives define it, you know, and therefore maybe I'm on your side." And I guess what I would say is I don't really think there's as much overlap here. I think sometimes people on the libertarian right get kind of sucked in to this kind of new right or alt right um, by by thinking there's something in common when there's not really. That in fact the new right has holds to views that are really anti-libertarian.
So, I mean, I kind of agree, but like, here's where I disagree slightly because I think the problem is the use of what you started out by saying the projection of liberalism.
Mhm.
And it's kind of like, so when I see people like Nick Fuentes or your Stephen Wolfs or your Christian nationalists, your, you know, even like CJ Engels, who was like a former libertarian, rejecting modern liberalism, I guess, and this might be where we differ. I go, well, you're right to reject modern liberalism, but I kind of say, well, you're right to reject modern liberalism because it's no longer actual liberalism, right? And insofar as I have a soft spot and a sort of ideological, you know, sort of like root or like shared ancestry with classical liberalism,
Mhm.
I'm an ANCAP. So like my view of liberalism is like pretty good, but didn't go far enough, right? And like there were some fatal flaws, I think, in that recipe that lead to modern liberalism. And so I think part of the miscalculation here is that some of the new right people are kind of tracing the roots of modern liberalism to classical liberalism and going, well, because this came from classical liberalism, we have to reject it and we have to go back to something older than that. Because some of the ideas you brought up are actually just more like they're older right-wing ideas. So again, it kind of gets arbitrary when you're talking about, is it new right or is the new right just kind of like morphing back into what the old right was before the neoconservatives. It's hard to say. And insofar as they are, it's like when they're rejecting liberalism, sometimes it'll kind of appear like we have some alignment, but then when they're rejecting not just modern liberalism, but the core tenets of liberalism being individualism and property rights, and like limited government and not egalitarianism, in like the colloquial sense, but sort of a something that actually Nick Fuentes says in this conversation, a sort of equality under the law, right? That these are things to strive for in society. They're rejecting that and saying like, well, that's what led to today. And I'm like, no, it's insofar as liberalism had those key tenets, but then mixed in some other things that were incompatible with those core tenets, that we get modern liberalism. And so it's like, I think we have to simultaneously go back and go forward, right? It's like we're kind of like, hey, we veered off the path of what liberalism had going for it into like, chasing down its worst parts. And we need to go back and like chase down those good parts. And like, my point is like to people like, hey, you took liberalism all the way down to postmodernism and then feel like you have to go all the way back. Like, no, what you need to do is go back to, the Declaration of Independence, but then go further and go down the Spooner to Rothbard route.
Right.
Like
yeah. No, I just read Mises's book Liberalism, and what struck me about it is, he's trying, because he's not an anarchist, that he's trying to sort of join two things together. One is liberalism and where it leads, which is free markets and free people and property rights, but he's appending it to the state, right? And so so I think that's, when you sort of say, okay, well, what is liberalism teaching? What's teaching the fundamental quality of all people? What happens if we append the state to that? Oh, well, that looks like democracy, right? And so I think that is kind of part of the problem, is liberalism does become something else when you add state, when you keep the state on it, that it wouldn't look like otherwise. But I think sometimes, though, there is also a, in trying to veer away from that, sometimes you have a veer in the other direction. And we won't get too into Hoppe today, but I think Hoppe is trying to avoid that mistake of democracy. And he sort of goes into like, well, I'm not saying I'm for monarchy, but it is better than democracy. and
even then, I think that's kind of I think that's what Hoppians think Hoppe's saying. But I do think Hoppe does a good enough job at saying that it's more nuanced than that. That there are things about monarchy that, like, if you're evaluating the trade-offs, that like I actually think Hoppe would probably agree with this. That in the short term, democracy can be better than monarchy, but in the long run, because monarchies tended to have at least some kind of like pseudo aspect of like you're not just a temporary steward of the resources of the nation, but that like these kind of go by generation, that there was a more of an incentive to have a slightly lower time preference when evaluating things. And so that was in some ways over the long run, like it was, again, a mixed bag and a trade-off, but like anyway, Hoppe is always, I think, though, appealing to like, I'm not a monarchist and I don't propose we go back to monarchy. It's just a useful foil to show that like democracy isn't a universal good. It's a mixed bag, and even monarchy is a mixed bag. There are, there were some monarchies that weren't quite as totalitarian or as much of, these giant warmongers, these giant imperial, like for every Great Britain or like the European colonial powers that were like monarchies, there were also these small monarchies that kind of just like, kept to themselves and people kind of lived peacefully. So it's, we tend to kind of like want to, in the West, I think, have this sort of like, the world was barbaric and evil and violent until democracy came down and say that's why I think Hoppe's, the book is aptly named Democracy, the God That Failed, because democracy has become an idol in our society, even though I would say that, like, there are times where we probably could be grateful that we live in a democracy compared to other political systems, because it's just about evaluating the trade-offs.
Well, and I think that Hoppe is making primarily an economic argument. He's not making a hierarchical argument necessarily. Like, I think there's folks on the new right and maybe a little bit on the libertarian right that would make a somewhat different argument, that would sort of appeal more to the idea of hierarchy as inherently valuable. I think his argument is that when resources are privately managed, they're managed better than when you have superintendents of a democracy that sort of giving out favors to people willy-nilly to stay in office. And I think that's a really interesting thought experiment and a valuable point. I do think he understates the sense in which monarchy is also wasteful, but just in different ways, that resources are given to the king for his purposes to be wasted rather than for the benefit of the people.
It's still a central planner, right? Yeah. But that's why sometimes the monarchies that didn't seem so bad, it's kind of like actually the same problem with like some social democracies. They don't seem so bad. It's like, it's kind of the same thing. We go, well, yeah, they have like, listen, there's parts of, the Scandinavian countries that have like what looks like social democracy. But yeah, they have a social safety net that's rather, like it looks bigger and more, socialist than what we have. But also their economy is kind of like way more free market than we are, right? And so they have this like these wealthy capitalist economies that are funding these social safety nets and kind of making them work, and it's small scale, right? And monarchies that were these small scale things, because like centrally planning a small region is and being a smaller kingdom who can probably impede upon the free market of your people less, that was like less problematic than, the big giant ones that were exploiting everyone. But we should probably try to, so I think the last clip before I cut out was just the part about the president could bomb a wedding, but on the same day, say blacks in the ladder would be a bigger story. I think I heard part of your reaction there, but I think I missed the tail end of it.
Well, you know what I might do here, because I know we're a little bit limited on time. Maybe let's jump to 42 minutes. If you can get it up. Oh, I think you're muted right now.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying, as long as my computer cooperates with me and doesn't crash again. I was so worried about my laptop crashing, and then it was the computer that crashed. There we go.
Maybe. Right about 42 minutes.
There are legitimate grievances on both sides, and there are illegitimate grievances.
Right.
There are legitimate voices expressing those grievances that actually, because I said this on the Charlie Kirk show, after Charlie got shot, I think there was a real threat of like war. I think there still is, because left-wingers are shooting people and blowing stuff up, and eventually a right-winger is going to retaliate, and then is it going to be like the 60s and 70s? That's a question. But I said on my show after Charlie died, the important thing is, let's get a new consensus of people that don't want that, that don't want war, that don't want their opponents to die, that don't want to murder each other. I said, I'm Christian. I don't believe in murder. I don't believe in revenge. I said, and not all people are Christian, and not all Christians believe that, actually. And so I think moving forward, there needs to be an uncomfortable coming together of people that have grievances, legitimate grievances with each other, but who both want harmony, want to live in peace, don't want bloodshed, leaders from both sides to come together. But I'm not optimistic. I think that the most cynical, calculating people rise to the top. They will incite and exploit the divisions and try to vie for control. And I think, conflict is more likely than peace at this point.
Yeah, it's very hard. It's very hard to keep those, because it's so easy. It's so easy, And by the way, just because you mentioned it, and I did say this publicly a bunch, but I really did appreciate your episode after Charlie Kirk. Thank you for that. So it was, it reminds, I was on Piers Morgan debating that Brandom.
Wait. Hey, I can mute the YouTube while you're figuring it out. I can't hear it now. Can you hear it? Maybe you can. Anyway, I think I got it muted if you want to try to work on pausing it.
All right, am I still here?
Yeah, you're still here.
Okay. I don't know why we might have to stop with the sharing thing because it, for some
We
reason,
might
when
have.
my computer does that, it's like, whoa, that's too much. When I try to pause it. But anyway, if you want to, yeah,
Yeah,
you can play.
I want to say something positive about what Nick Fuentes says here, which is that I think he gives a really, I think, clear-headed and positive address here. And I think, friends can address conflicts and issues and try to find a way forward. And if we aren't willing to do that, if we want to live in our little grievance bubbles, then yeah, racial tensions are just going to get worse. And that's why the far left and the far right are really aiming for the same thing, which is, I think, racial disharmony and just ongoing eternal resentment. Um, I think the civil rights movement in the 1960s was effective because it was rooted in Christian teaching and that belief in the value of every human life. And unfortunately, I don't think you can say the same for progressive movements on race today. They come from something else. It's, this kind of weird, kind of filtered Marxism and, identity politics. And it's just not the same thing. And so I'm hoping that maybe the spark of interest in Christianity that we're starting to see among young men, especially kind of leaning right, might be able to transcend that kind of religious right distortion and bring people to the feet of the real Jesus. Because I think if we really want to build a better, freer, more peaceful America, then I think we need that. I'm glad that Fuentes does not want violence, but I do, of course, have to say that he is part of the problem here because his own ideology is really inconsistent with the idea of living together peacefully. Um,
So what did you think? Because I don't think we're going to be able to share more screen, but what did you think about the part where uh, Dave does start to present some pushback to Nick's ideology, right? Because I think I was going to play a little bit from the 55 to like 60-minute mark where Nick does echo again some of the things he was saying in the clip you brought up, where
mhm.
he's like, "Listen, he's like, I am racist to a point where I have some prejudices and beliefs about certain groups. I'm not like if people are on a scale from like radical egalitarianism that like doesn't see any color or differences in ethnic groups at all, and then like maybe like full scale like eugenics Nazi racist. I think Nick is saying that he's not on the side of seeing no differences, but that like even though while he sees differences, he still says we should have a government that recognizes the rights of everybody. And I don't want there to be, race wars necessarily and violence between groups. And like the way out of that is to try. So I think he's being a little bit inconsistent there. And I think Dave then tries to like piggyback off that to be like, well, okay, I'm glad you're saying these things about wanting peace. I'm glad you're like recognizing that like we should have like, something like equal rights, but like then don't you kind of have like, he's kind of like trying to pull him back to be like, isn't some of your rhetoric pushing us in the opposite direction? Like, like when I'm calling out Israel, I'll call out, policies, I'll call out things that their leaders have done, that their militaries have done. Because I'll even point out where sometimes Jewish identity and religion can become a stumbling block that puts on like ideological blinders to the actions that Israel does, and that and the West and maybe Jews and Christians are broadly supportive of Israel doing, in the same way that like we as Americans can have blinders on, whether because of patriotism or some Christians who are dispensational. Radical dispensationalists will have a certain blinder on. So he's like, I do that, and when people try to come after me and go anti-Semite, it's like, well, it doesn't stick very well because I'm being very precise. But when you go like, it's the Jews, right? He's like, well, no, it doesn't have anything to do with, Dave the dentist, right? You know what I mean? Like who has his own little, like, like the average Jew has nothing to do with any of this. And you're kind of being part of the problem here in terms of, fueling the sort of like identity politics warfare rather than trying to diffuse it. So I'm trying to summarize what Dave said there. If you think I left anything out, you can add on to it. But what did you think about that segment in terms of
Yeah.
taking that approach?
Yeah, I mean, I wish he'd spent more time discussing it than he did. It was kind of a side point. I think what he did say was valuable. It's just, I think I texted you. I said something like I'd give Smith about a B plus when he does address the issue of racism here, but maybe a C minus or a D plus when it actually comes to the weight he puts on it. uh, and so, I mean, I'm no expert on Nick Fuentes. This is the longest I've ever heard him talk. And so maybe I was interested in the ways in which he was trying to sort of say, well, I'm not like the most, when you think of a real word racist, that's not exactly what I am. I don't know, for example, if he's a race realist. He may be kind of in that sort of, conservative German Revolution from 100 years ago, that kind of Oswald Spengler thing where he's like, well, I'm not a race realist. I'm not actually down for what Hitler wants to say. I'm just saying, because I think because Fuentes says this at some point, he's like, if you're Jewish, you have an identity and you can't see past that identity, that it's like this kind of a cultural moral realism or cultural moral relativism or something. Someone did comment that he is a race realist, and maybe that's true. I'm not sure. But he does want to kind of sort of argue that to some extent you're sort of trapped in those identity politics categories, that you can't really be objective, that you can't really be an individual, that your individual identity is not the most real thing about you. And that's very, very much in that kind of, radical revolutionary right.
Right.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think that the problem with evaluating any of Nick's beliefs is that he is sort of by nature duplicitous. And this is not like, this might come across as a defense. It's not a defense, it's a criticism.
Right.
And I think if he's a Christian, and I want to like try to be charitable here to that claim, but like if you're a Christian, you're told in the Bible to, to try to be blameless before others and to recognize the weight of the words that you say. Now, I will grant what him and Dave talked about, that there is something negative to social media and to our society, that we give young people this sort of like ability to go online and say a bunch of wild, crazy stuff that like when you're 16 or 17 or 19 or 20, like, Dave made this point that like, back in the day, yeah, when you were young, you would say a lot of stupid stuff, but it was like on Xbox Live, like gaming with your friends. And like, it wasn't like, on record for the world to then, see and hold you to 5 years later, 10 years later. And didn't necessarily become like,
I was gonna say there was no libs of TikTok to out you for saying stupid progressive things either, right?
Right, exactly. And now we live in this thing where not only does that happen, but then like you can be sort of shoehorned into being like, well, that's your identity, and then there's like this feedback loop that comes into it. So I think that's all worthy of critique. But to not, if Nick was still 19 or 21, I would maybe be more sympathetic to that. But I think you can see as he's maturing, he's 26 now, maybe he's starting to, pull at the weak foundations of his worldview, in terms of saying like, well, if I'm a Christian, can I really be advocating for collectivism and violence? And if I'm a Christian, can I, should I be viewing the world through these collectivist lenses? And then also evaluating his own past performance, where he's like, I was often saying edgelordy things and making jokes and being like, let's own the libs. But now I see people who are saying like, it is, let's kill all the, this X group or whatnot. And he's like, well, I don't want that. I'm not a hateful. Now, again, maybe some people will say he's just lying. It's performative. You can't take him at his word. I don't know. Right. I'm a good judge of character when I've spent enough time with someone in person. I'm not a good judge of character, like, just like watching people's, on YouTube for a little bit of time. I don't think you get a real snapshot of that. But if I'm going to take, I'll wrap up. I'll try to end here quickly. If I'm going to take Nick at his word that he's trying to be genuine, then I think that like we need people like Dave and others in his life to be pushing him more, to be like, yeah, like, you're right. Like, you said some really awful collectivist, hateful things in the past, and maybe you just thought you were being edgy. I've done that. There are things that I'm glad are not on the internet, or if they are, they're hard to find, of things that I said when I was early on Twitter or on YouTube when I had no following. And I just thought that like, when people would challenge me to be edgy, I'd be like, well, I'm not going to back away from a challenge. I'll say whatever outrageous thing someone wants me to say. That now I'd be, ashamed if that came out. And I wouldn't want that to be there, not because I'd want to do some kind of like woke left, like humiliation ritual. But I'd be like, yeah, I was young and I said, dumb, ignorant things, and I've grown up, but I'm not like that anymore. So I think like Nick's kind of like feeling that tension, but then like, imagine feeling that tension as a young person maturing, but you're like, oh man, I've kind of built my entire career on like, having millions of followers now who are used to me doing this certain way. To be fair, Nick's gotten pushback. Like when Nick said, I don't think Israel killed Charlie Kirk. And when Nick is, trying to backpedal some of his more extreme positions, he's getting, blasted by some of his fans and whatnot. And they talked about this later in the conversation where people are now like, oh, Nick's a Fed and all that. Right. And so I don't know. I think that anyone who tries to necessarily like reduce Nick Fuentes to be like, he's all evil, or to like, go the other side and say, oh, he's just misunderstood, he's really a good guy. Like, no, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think he's said a lot of awful, evil things, but he's also a human being who probably does have some knowledge of the truth. And maybe he's starting to feel that pull, and we should be praying for him to like, give into those good impulses and not the bad ones.
Yeah. No, I mean, I talked about this earlier, the idea of the kind of the racist family member. I mean, there are people I know who I care about who have, stupid, ignorant, racist opinions, but, thankfully they don't have millions of followers. But but I also know that that they have a lot of good qualities despite their ignorance. Well, and, there's in particular, I think where Smith is really useful here. I think he says this more or less directly at about an hour 38. Fuentes wants to do this whole thing about not being in favor of racial violence, but he's really inconsistent on this point, because I think once we've decided that identity politics is the way forward, that those outside of our ethnic identity group are against us and we have to fight them because we can't really find any common ground. I mean, yeah, of course that's going to lead to violence. And so, I mean, that's where left-wing identity politics logically leads. It's where right-wing identity politics logically leads. It's where Fuentes' identity it's where identity politics leads. And so I think if he's going to stand up for human dignity and peaceful relations between different ethnic groups, I think he just needs to abandon the identity politics. He needs to embrace classical liberalism. And Smith does say that, and I give him credit for that. Like I said, I wish he spent a little more time talking about it. But
yeah, again, I think it's one of those like temperament things where like, and I have this too. Now I think my Christianity pushes me to kind of like equalize those forces more, to confront people more than maybe I would be inclined to where I think they're wrong, but to be simultaneously more gracious to the people I view as my enemy. And I think that's tough, right? But there's a balance there. And I think Dave is like, well, listen, like Nick might have said all these bad things, but he's on my show saying really good things now, and we're being friendly. So again, I think it's like you want to. I think he said at one point, "I'm not trying the Daryl Davis you," but I think he kind of is, but isn't. He's like, I don't, because you don't want someone to feel like this relationship is really just a transaction, and I'm just like, same with evangelism, right? You don't want someone to be like, I'm only interested in you to like convert you to my religion and that's it, right? No, like you want to be like, listen, I'm interested in you as a person. I want to build a relationship with you. And then like, the fruit of that should be a friendship and the opportunity to then be like, as your friend, to have like, listen, some things probably are better off being said and having, confrontations happen behind closed doors, right? Some of that can be done out in the open, but some of it is, people are sometimes when they're in the spotlight, they have an audience, they're more resistant to change. So I hear what you're saying. Like, I think a lot of us, and even me at times, I was like, man, I wish there was more screen time of the pushback, but would that have been the most beneficial for Nick and for like the people who follow Nick? Or like Dave said, like, I struggle with this because on one hand, I've seen that racism and anti-Semitism is a bigger problem than I initially thought, but I still struggle with like, but I think Dave is more right than he's wrong in terms of like, yeah, the way to combat that is not to spurg out about it and not to finger wag about it, but to just kind of, like go to those people and be like, okay, you believe all this stuff about Jewish people? Well, I'm Jewish, and just talk to me. I'm nothing like that. And you just kind of like you slowly disavow people of those those views through them getting to know you, like Daryl Davis did. So
yeah, and I think you could make an argument or a case for what Dave might be doing, right? Because from the outside, it seems like he's spending a lot of time saying we're basically on the same team, right? And it's like, really? You think you're on the same team? And but there is that kind of thing, I think, where when you want to try to persuade somebody to come onto your side, it's not necessarily always the case that good arguments are going to do it. That you want them to feel like there's a connection, that you guys are on the same team, that they sort of trust you, They're more interested in hearing you. They know that where you're coming from is not like a finger wagging place. And so I think he does say some valuable things. I guess I felt that it was kind of the elephant in the room, and I think maybe a little more time should have been spent on it, especially in a public kind of setting. What he said, what he does with Nick in private is maybe a different thing, but you kind of hope that Dave will sort of address those points more directly, and that Nick will have sort of an opportunity or to respond to it. There's a couple things though that Dave says I think that's really helpful. At about hour and 36 minutes. Dave sort of says that Jewish identity politics warps moral perspectives, and so he's seemingly agreeing with Fuentes there, because that's Fuentes's point, is that these identity politics kind of become who we are, and we can't see objectively. But really, he's not helping Fuentes, because what he's saying is true of identity politics in general, and so what's interesting here, he says that Fuentes and the Zionists are in fundamental agreement about the framing of Israel's relationship to the Jewish people.
Yeah, right.
Because Israel says if you're against Israel, the state, the people with the guns and the whatever, you're anti-Semitic, right? And then people like Nick are really the people who are cynically taking advantage of that claim.
They're like saying that unironically,
yeah. They're saying, well, Israel has said that if you disagree with us, you're anti-Semitic. So
right.
I disagree with them, therefore I'm anti-Semitic. And I mean, that's just sophistry. But I think, it's not true. But yes, I mean, and I think we talked about this before. I mean, I think that's really putting Jewish people around the world in danger to make those kind of arguments.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think, I'll give you the last word here. Here'll be my last word. I think that Dave sort of has done a good job at setting up the rest of the liberty movement. And then especially, I think us here at LCI, I think we're uniquely equipped to try to then take this sort of starting point and build upon it. And I think, a lot of what I want to focus on is to talk to the people who are in agreement with Nick on this sort of identitarian worldview, who identify as Christian, especially, and to just be like, well, what does the Bible say about these things? And to go back to scripture and to have this be a conversation, not to, again, not to sort of listen, all have, as Romans says, all have fallen short. We all have bad ideas that we have believed at some point. We've all done bad things. So this is not like a ganging up thing. I think, listen, I mean, part of what Paul is doing in the book of Romans is addressing tensions between ethnic, groups and all this history and baggage between the Jews and the Gentiles, right? And so we're still as much as I think sometimes because of the internet and digital media and all this, we think we face problems today that are so unique, which is kind of true. But then at the same time, it's man, it's the same problems that they were dealing with over 2,000 years ago, even, the very first Christians and the apostles in the early church. And, going back to those ancient texts and seeing what they have to say about, these divides and what, Christ has done with these dividing walls and whatnot. I think that's important. And I think we at LCI, if someone is if someone like Nick was in front of us right now, if it was Nick himself, and he's saying, I'm pro-peace, I don't want race wars, and I'm a Christian, and, I want to love Christ, but then we run into how do we construct society? How do we have justice? How do we actually have peace in a, civil sense? I think that's what we here at LCI can be uniquely positioned to do, is to kind of bridge that gap between faith and politics. Because I think to some extent, the church has failed, just broadly speaking, kind of generically here, has sort of because the church overall has not done a good enough job at talking about politics. They've kind of created the environment where people are well, it's kind of that radical two kingdoms, a warping of two kingdoms, where it's well, I'm a Christian in my personal life, but my political life is just completely separate. And what I believe there is, I can advocate for war and mass violence and all this, but still, love my neighbor, which I know you have particular. You could pull your pacifist card out here, but let's not open up that can of worms. I'll give you the last word though to kind of close this out here before we call it a night.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, so basically, I thought that Smith, gives some light pushback against Fuentes here, not as much as I would have liked. When he did, it was direct and to the point, which I thought was valuable. At the end of the day, I just don't think Smith is really all that worried about stuff like racism or anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial. I don't think he really feels that leads in any particularly, terrible direction. They're just not really high on his list of cultural values that should be instilled, I guess, not nearly as high as, regulating the number of Mexicans who can come here. So I hear people say that the left overplayed their hand and kind of cynically using these concerns about bigotry for their own political benefit. And I agree, and it's a fair point. I don't think that the proper response to that is to say, well, I guess it really doesn't matter that much after all. Racism is not really a concern I have. It doesn't matter if we're repeating, Weimar Republic era talking points about the globalist Jews. That's just speech. Doesn't matter. I think we actually should address those concerns. I think, you just be honest and say, well, this is not racism, or this is not really the kind of, this kind of, Archie Bunker-esque, comment here is, maybe it's in poor taste, but, that's not that big of a deal. You have to be able to make those distinctions. But, this idea that we should give up on being concerned about racism because leftists have abused the category, I don't think is a valid one. I think Smith might say that concerns about racism are generally just attempts to create thought crime or regulate free speech. And libertarians believe in free speech, so who cares? But he's also addressed, we didn't play the clip, but he's addressed in this very video that social consequences for horrible speech can be legitimate, right? And so there is a distinction to be made here between censorship and just, being, ostracized because you say ignorant, hateful, horrible, dehumanizing things. And so I'm not 100% sure exactly where that sweet spot is, but I do think that we can believe in political free speech. We can nourish a culture of free inquiry. But I think we can also, and should also say that we have these cultural values that every human being is made in the image of God. Every human being is equal, even if they're different in different regards. They look different, may have different aptitudes or whatever. That there's a fundamental equality that's there. And that when people come out and say that that's not true, they are, just not where we are as a culture. Their values are not where we are, and they are ultimately anti-liberal, anti-libertarian, anti-Christian, however you want to describe it. And so I don't know. I maybe this was the right approach for this particular conversation for Smith to take to endear himself a little bit more to Nick. But I wish there was a little more that could be pulled from this. I mean, it's a 3-hour conversation for Pete's sake. There should have been a little bit more than just them talking about how they're all on the same team. And I don't know. I feel it could have been better.
All right. I mean, that's, I think it's fair to have that perspective. I guess I disagree respectfully to some extent. I mean, probably could have been a little bit, but more at certain points. But I also think it would have been a little bit too heavy-handed if it was like 50% of the conversation. So I don't know, maybe there's a happy medium there. But I also think sometimes, I think there was a point where like maybe Dave was saying stuff and expecting Nick to give more pushback, and Nick didn't give as much pushback. And so then Dave could have kept harping on it. But I don't know. I think it's complicated, but I get where you're coming from. I certainly think in general, we as I'm a right-wing libertarian, and I think we right-wing libertarians need to kind of, wrestle with what you're saying there. Like, I don't think I'm in complete agreement, but I think that in general, you're right. Like on the big picture, that we've become so desensitized to the left being hyperbolic about racism and bigotry and anti-Semitism that like we've become numb to the point of thinking that like, there is no problem and we should never condemn it. I would say maybe there's a happy medium where we're not doing like cringe, like I denounce bigotry as irrational and repugnant and clutching our pearls, but that we can just kind of offer, like, I think you would agree at the times where Dave was doing that, that maybe you wanted more of it, but when he was doing it, I think he was, modeling a good way to push back against those kinds of things. So
He was addressing the right concerns, right?
Yep. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties. I will be back here next Monday and hopefully have all that stuff worked out for you. I believe next week I'm having a conversation with Rebecca Massey who you guys might know had that case with Fire when she was illegally detained and I think arrested for a time for just like, calling out very obvious corruption from her city council and mayor. So I'm gonna have her on the show. We're gonna have a good conversation. That'll be again next Monday at I think like 7:30. But check the time online. Make sure you subscribe at Biblical Anarchy on X and at LCI Official for the Libertarian Christian Institute, and then at Cantus Firmus CC, which is on the screen for Cody. And check out the rest of our shows at the Christians for Liberty Network at christiansforliberty.net. And yeah, as I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ, take care.